Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Surveys During the Pandemic, Be Prepared as CMS and Accreditation Surveys Resume, which is hosted by Greeley, a Chartis Group company. My name is Tanisha Rivaz, and I will be assisting with moderating this webinar. And now, I'd like to hand it over to Bud Pate, who will begin the webcast.
Thank you, Ty. Appreciate it a lot, and welcome everybody. So just a few words before we get going about who Chartis is and who Greeley is. Maybe there may be many of you who know both of us, but at the end of last year, Greeley was just thrilled and delighted to become part of the Chartis group. And if you haven't heard of Chartis, there's about 400 folks working really state of the art across the country, looking at electronic health records and information technology, making that work for physicians and hospitals across the country, and doing analytical tools so that there can be a solid database strategy and performance. And so that was sort of a good fit with Greeley. And so we were just delighted to sort of leverage and grow those resources within Chartis. And with Greeley, we, for those of you who know us, you know that we have a very active peer review bylaws physician alignment practice, which was Greeley's legacy, along with medical staff credentialing and privileging. And then we have a very large patient safety and compliance and life safety and physical environment practice. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But of course, we do consulting, so we'll come in the field. We have online education events. In fact, there's a new virtual education. We usually, in non-pandemic times, a few times a year, 3 times a year or so, we get just hundreds of physicians and hospital leaders together in a group practice. And that's always been a great experience to go off site and do that. And we're really excited this year to meet the challenge of COVID by doing it virtually. So if you haven't checked that out, check that out. That's coming up soon. We have a big interim staffing practice as well. So if you're down a person, we can look for that, the chief medical officer or credentialing person. And of course, we have whole credentialing solutions that are available. We have a very active external peer review where we have a panel of national experts in all specialties going out and doing peer review of individual cases. And of course, we partner with folks across the country through our membership program. When we get a little bit now, Lisa and I, and we're going to introduce ourselves more formally here in a second, are part of the safety, patient safety and compliance practice. And we call it a partnership for survey success is sort of our tagline or the product line there. And we, of course, deal with survey readiness and survey response, whether it's a simple statement of deficiencies or accreditation report, all the way up to, avoiding terminations and we are the national leader in hospital-based CMS systems improvement agreements where we'll spend a year or more with a client getting them back in CMS's good graces. So we have a large practice there, but we also have specialty-based practice, including infection prevention readiness program, behavioral health, patient safety, quality monitoring, and we accomplish compliance, safety, and all the rest simply by making things more streamlined, making the right thing to do, the easy thing to do, getting rid of unnecessary documentation in such a way that you still comply with everything, but you actually enable success at the bedside. And then, of course, all this is in the context, like we say, of all of the other Chartis and Greeley services. And I want to particularly point out our life safety and physical environment service. So we do this in concert with those other things. Your presenters today, let me start with the good side. Lisa Eddy is our vice president for that patient safety and compliance practice I was just talking about. Morning, Lisa, how are you?
I'm good, thank you, Bud. Just a little bit about myself. Registered nurse, have those credentials there, also CPHQ, but my background really has been in nursing leadership, quality, risk management, and overall compliance. So that's what I bring to the table. And then I'll introduce Bud Pate.
That would be me. Yeah, I'm sorry to scare you with that picture, but I'm the Director of Content and Learning, and I've been with Greeley for almost 17 years now. And prior to that, I spent 15 years with Kaiser, and prior to that, I was on the dark side of the force with CMS state agency out of Los Angeles. So it's a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to kick off the first few slides here and talk a little bit about what we're going to try and accomplish here in the next few minutes. Now, on July 15th, we had another webinar, and that's still posted on our website. So please feel free to go to our website and post this. And by the way, let me address this right now. This webinar will also be posted, hopefully by mid next week, on the website, and that's where all of the handouts will be available. You know, any kind of letters we're talking about, Q&A will be posted. In other words, whatever questions were raised here today that we had to put off until that will be posted on the website. So look for that. So that's at greeley.com, and please come back to it next week for handouts and a full actual recording of this webinar will be there, along with the July 15th one, and other ones are available on greeley.com website. So just with that as background, what we're going to be talking about here in the next few minutes is not to repeat really what we did on July 15th, but really to expand that, because we've learned more now about what's going to be happening in the middle of this pandemic and where the survey agencies are catching up and what's happening. So we may cover a few of the same topics along the way, but really the difference between this and July 15th slides, we spent a little bit more time on, the long range, where the citations were, that sort of thing. So this is more of an update to say this is what to expect here during the pandemic as far as the surveys that are happening. And this is rapidly changing. We'll probably have another update for you as things change as we move into the post-election fourth quarter. We're going to talk about the resumption of surveys by state agencies and accreditation organizations, really at the behest of CMS. And we're going to focus on look at the focus of these surveys and the process for these surveys during the pandemic. We will then take this as the long view, and there's a little bit more information we've learned since our last meeting together of what to expect from surveys in the years ahead. A little bit more data, the same conclusions I think that we had before, and then why these changes really make it important to permanently fix consistent compliance vulnerabilities. Then adaptations, therefore, based on that to your survey readiness and response situation, and that's what we're going to talk about. Here's how we're going to get to those things. We're going to talk about CMS restarting survey activities and what their mid-August instructions were, and how the agencies, the state agencies, and the accrediting organizations are responding to that. What those intra-pandemic and post-pandemic surveys are going to look like, at least as far as we can see far ahead. We can see long-term. I think it's the short-term that is changing, so we'll give you our best estimate of that. And then the implications for survey response and readiness, and that's really what we want to go over. So, so let's dig right into it and the new information. On August 17th, CMS essentially turned the survey process back on. And here's the letter, and this is available. We probably put that in the downloads packet if you're really interested. It's mostly in bureaucratese, but we're going to tell you right now essentially what it said. First of all, it acknowledged the background, and we want to talk a little bit about the background before August 17th and after of other sorts of directives from CMS. Of course, on the March 13th, the national emergency was declared, and the CMS limited state agency activities to immediate jeopardy complaints and abatement issues. They also did a few overdue nursing home recertifications. So they were still going out to some nursing homes, although as we remember back in March and even through to today, you know, there's a lot of activity going on in nursing homes. And so I'm not sure how much time there was for routine recertification visits because the state agencies, quite frankly, were there trying to help nursing homes across the country just cope with the pandemic. Then also at that time, they were still wanted to increase, CMS wanted to increase the supply of certified providers. And so they were allowing virtual accreditation surveys. We're going to talk more about the virtual survey process in a little bit. They issued a bunch of waivers in March, and there've been slight changes to that as time goes on. Under 1135 of the Social Security Act, 1135 waivers, those waivers are still in place. They have not been taken down. The emergency is still in place. There was, of course, an emphasis on the new daily data reporting that came along in July. And then they started this last bullet there before the second set. They started infection control, COVID infection control surveys. Whenever the state agency or accrediting group goes out, they're given this checklist that's essentially COVID-related infection prevention that they do as they're doing their other activities. It's pretty straightforward, but we're going to talk a lot more about infection prevention here coming up in the slide presentation and the implications for the days and years ahead. Lisa's going to spend some time on that. So what this then August 17th memorandum said that, okay, guys, resume normal survey, on-site survey activities if you're in a phase 3 community and some phase 2s if you wanted to. But for sure, if you're in a phase 3 community, then you needed to restart. Well, what's a phase 3 community? These phases are in the White House's COVID plan, where they have phase 1, which is essentially in crisis. Phase 2 is when things are getting better, and phase 3 is essentially when things are back to a sort of a baseline, a low infection rate, declining hospitalizations, that sort of thing. So if you're in those, then for those areas, the state agencies have been instructed to resume the previous activities. And these are those activities and the order in which they are to be prioritized. First are revisits of outstanding citations to clear those, unless, of course, you could do a desk review. And we'll talk about a desk review in a second. Then, I mean, remember, immediate jeopardy complaints were never off the table, but now second priority are other complaint investigations that don't allege immediate jeopardy. Special purpose renal dialysis facilities, then after that initial certification surveys, then after that routine, you know, every 2-3 year surveys of providers where there is a statutory interval, and then 6 are routine resurveys without a statutory interval. Hospitals fall under number 6. So, and then of course, because they were resuming activity on August 17th, 10 days later, all plans of correction that had been asked for during the first phases of the pandemic came due 10 days later. And so that's probably worked its way through right now. So one thing to remember here when we're thinking about state agencies is the routine resurveys and initial certification surveys are not performed by the state agency at all. So they are, if you have deemed status. So if the hospital is, or so for example, new hospital that's coming in as an accredited hospital, either by Joint Commission or one of the other accrediting organizations, the state agency wouldn't really become involved in that. And so that little box at the end is where the accrediting bodies are focused is on the initial accreditation surveys and the routine follow-up surveys. The rest of the activities have already been in process. So I hope that makes sense. I talked about a desk review. I'm not going to spend too much time on a desk review, but essentially a desk review is where you send all your evidence of compliance into the state and they look at it without having to come out. A lot of people do that. They get in the habit of sending evidence, and sometimes surveyors like to see it, some do, some don't. CMS does not want you to send in that evidence unless you qualify for a desk review. And so this memo just talked about desk reviews of things that were cited between March and June, but we see a desk review for follow-up surveys to be a strategy that state agencies will use a lot. And of course, Joint Commission has essentially what a desk review process is in their evidence of standards compliance situation, which applies to most citations, but not all. Sometimes a follow-up is necessary. So that's what a desk review is. I'm going to talk briefly about the accreditation now. So we, in that August 17th memorandum, they did task the accrediting agencies to start doing surveys again, which, believe me, the accrediting agencies are interested in doing anyway, because that is how they budget and their time. And just as a reminder, we're going to be talking about the Joint Commission, but we don't want you to forget that there are other accrediting bodies, and what we're really talking about Joint Commission here, because they're the biggest player in town. But there are DNVGL, HFAP, and CIHQ are also impacted, and their response may be a little bit different than what the Joint Commission's response is to all of these challenges during the pandemic. So that's what I'm going to talk about. Let's see, where are we? So we talked about. So one of the things the Joint Commission started doing here back in March, when essentially everybody's taken out of the field, is they still had initial accreditations to be done. They still had to, increase the supply chain. So although they weren't doing routine surveys, if somebody wanted to start a new surgical center or a new, or come in as an initially accredited nursing home or hospital, they had to figure out how to do that. And so they were using iPads, tablets, upload of offsite review of medical records. They are essentially doing entire surveys without having set a foot on the organization. And they're going to continue to do those virtual surveys for some providers, at least right now. So right now, they're going to continue to do these virtual surveys for initial accreditations. All clinical laboratory surveys are going to be done virtually. The CLIA folks say, hey, this is a grand idea. Why don't you guys, at least for now, during the pandemic, do all your lab surveys? So we have a great client in Northern California right now who's expecting their survey of their lab any day now, and that's going to be entirely virtual. The SAMHSA approves opioid treatment programs through Joint Commission accreditation. So those are all done virtually. Disease-specific certifications are done virtually. And then non-deemed hospitals and other organizations like the Department of Defense, or VA hospitals, where they really don't have to be Medicare certified, they're doing them all virtually. However, CMS is still cogitating on whether or not to allow the virtual survey process for the hospitals by the Joint Commission, which poses a bit of a problem. So, and that's where we're at today. So where is the hospital survey process with the Joint Commission? Well, there's a lot of things that make it not really possible for a survey team to go on site. I mean, some states have restrictions, like if you're entering New York from another state, you have to self-quarantine for a few weeks. You know, some states, at least at the beginning, didn't have great testing capacity. I think that's the testing is being better, so they had to have that. So the different parts of the country do that. And then within a particular part of the country, or county is the way Joint Commission looks at it, between each county, are there a lot of new cases happening, and what is the prevalence of those things? And so that is the first set of criteria they look at to say, is this county, is Los Angeles ready for surveys? Is Chicago ready for surveys? Is Tulsa ready for surveys? They use the New York Times database and different databases to look at those things to say, yeah, theoretically we can go in there. But that last criteria is the difference between the blue line and the orange line, because sometimes the community is ready, but the hospital is still on their emergency management plan. So once the county is ready, they look for everybody coming due in that county, and they contact the people who are in that list, and see whether they're ready. And you can see that there's a big difference between whether the county is ready and whether the hospital within the county is ready. So at the beginning, they started this in June, and up through mid-August, only about 10% of the counties were really, or 10% of the hospitals in the country were ready for a survey. And that was declining. It was going down. So they changed the criteria a little bit. I mean, they took a really hard look. Are these criteria overly prescriptive? And they made a change and they felt comfortable with it. And that bumped it up, but it still isn't helping a lot, because still less than 40% of the hospitals in the country are eligible for surveys. So that poses a problem for them. And this is what their projection is right now as to how they're going to catch up. There's the on-sites and the virtuals, et cetera. You can look for that yourself. They're projecting that, and those are just projections. And ultimately, they're going to have to extend accreditations for some hospitals that go beyond the 3 years. And they understand that's going to be necessary. They still haven't worked that out quite yet. So that's the situation with the survey agencies. And so what I'm going to do is give it over to my colleague, Lisa, to say, okay, well, what are these surveys looking like now? And what do we expect them to look like in the near future? So Lisa?
Great. So thank you, Bud, and thank you everyone for joining us, participating on this webinar. We're going to look at the new survey normal as we're sort of moving through this pandemic. The next slide, please, Bud. One of the things that we know, if you could advance the slide. Thank you. Is that the focus of the state agencies and CMS termination actions really has remained the same. You can see here most of the findings are patient safety, patient rights, nursing clinical issues, and then the clinical environment, infection control, and surgical service related to infection control issues. Almost all of these resulting from these adverse actions, sanctions from adverse events that the hospital encounters and or self-reported events. So, but if you want to go to the next slide, one of the ways to prevent CMS from walking in your organization is identifying, excuse me, patient safety events and understanding the true causes of the harm events and focusing on them and fixing flaws in the systems that cause the harm events. As you see that, the more you focus and identify and reduce those events, the lower your harm events will be. So the most effective patient safety program is to avoid adverse actions by having a good, solid patient identification plan. But I'm getting a note from Tanisha that my audio is not great. Can you hear me on your side?
I can hear it. It is, it's breaking up a little bit. So why don't you try and do the next slide, see whether it improves, and if not, I'll step back in.
Okay, tell me, can you hear me now? Is this better?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. Let me know. Just give me a holler, folks. We want to make sure you can hear this. This is the Joint Commission's long game. Bud already talked about the deeming authority. One of the things that is very important to understand about the Joint Commission's long game is that they were only awarded a 2-year approval of their deeming authority by CMS in July. They were a little bit upset about this. They usually get a 4-year authority, and they were given only a 2-year authority. And by comparison, CIHQ was given 6 years. So what are the reasons for this? Well, there was a discrepancy rate, if you will, between the state agency findings, CMS findings, if you will, and those of the Joint Commission. A lot of those focusing around the Environment of Care and Life Safety Code. Also, the leadership issues and oversight, they felt there was a disconnect, CMS did. And just know that 50% of findings the Joint Commission currently has are within the Environment of Care and Life Safety Code that's heavily influenced by CMS. Also, one of the things I thought this was quite interesting on our calls with CMS, with Joint Commission, CMS did not like the Joint Commission's process of having daily briefings at the end of the day or at the beginning of the day with some surveys, didn't matter, because the hospital then CMS felt would have this time to go around and fix things when in fact we know that that really did happen. So it does happen. So CMS said, no, we don't like that process, and therefore we're only going to give you a 2-year deeming authority. So the Joint Commission will focus on those areas to sort of reduce the gap. Another challenge the Joint Commission has that will impact hospitals is that they really have to be getting serious around non-accreditation. And from our conversations with them, they're totally committed to this aspect. We want to emphasize that the most frequently traveled road to non-accreditation is PDA02, which is the repeat significant findings, those things that are pervasive, that aren't corrected, that they really become the most compelling reasons hospitals need to ensure they have a sustained compliance program. And we'll talk about that later. But if you'll see at the upper right-hand side of your screen, pervasive significant issues can rarely be permanently put to rest in 60 days, which is sort of this artificial number that the Joint Commission puts on, and CMS to some degree, you correcting things. So it's very important to have a good, strong, consistent, sustained compliance program. Another thing we want to point out is that the Joint Commission has worked diligently with SAFER matrix. It's been around for a while. It seems to be working well. They've also made significant improvements in their inter-rater reliability, which now allows for a much more consistent application of the assessment for deficiencies. Whereas they really didn't have an ability before to separate the smaller issues from the larger, more systemic issues. The SAFER matrix and the improved inter-rater reliability solves that issue for the most part. So all of us can anticipate stricter enforcement of the standards. And just keep in mind, over 1/2 of hospitals surveyed have one or more significant issues. That means a condition level finding, if you will, that engender a follow-up commission survey. That's why it's essential to implement actions that permanently resolve issues instead of the quick fixes that we sometimes see where organizations want to quickly get the evidence of standards compliance off their plate, get it done, and sometimes they use a Band-Aid solution that really doesn't work. But if we go, I'm going to turn it over to you for slide 20.
And I'm not going to spend too much time on this because, again, if you want to get a more detailed drill down onto our analysis of past findings, please check out that streaming of our July 15th webinar. But suffice it to say that the Joint Commission really has taken that 10-tier SAFER matrix, which they think highly of, and they've separated into lower significance and higher significant findings. And if you look at across the country over the last year, over almost 9,000 RFIs, 75% are low significance, leaving really only 25% to focus on. You're not going to throw a PDA02, in other words, a non-accreditation because of repeat significant findings, if they're lower significance. It's really the higher significance findings. It doesn't mean you can ignore the other 75%, but you don't really have to worry about them as much because they'll probably come back again. Gee, there was a penetration in the fire, smoke partition or something somewhere. Well, that's always going to happen. So, and again, that's 75% of the findings. However, the trend is going up of the number of hospitals that do have significant findings. This is a graph of condition level findings. There are significant findings that aren't at the condition level, I would guess, but by and large, there's, when they say condition level finding, that's for sure a significant issue. And so hospitals going up here, more than half of them in 2019 had these condition level findings. It went back down, I think, in the first part of 2020 and the last part of 2019. So it's around half of the hospitals, and this is looking backwards. And again, I don't want to spend too much time on this because, like I said, in July 15th, we did go into detail on this. But when we look at what those really high significant, if we're only looking at the high significant findings, we've got suicide, we've got a few things about medications, we've got this administration, ordering, expiration dates, sort of the common issues around medications, but more than two-thirds of the citations, the issues, were in infection prevention, whether it was disinfection, temperature, humidity, just a safe environment, cleanliness, food safety, the usual suspects, and we can go into that analysis a little bit further if you want. But that's looking in the past. And just a word to the wise here, we do have available, if you go to the Greeley website, a lot of training out there on suicide, both clinical issues of suicide prevention, ligature resistance, which continues to be, believe it or not, a heavy hitter, leadership, procedure-related infection prevention, sterilization, disinfection cycle. We're going to continue to be pumping these specialty specific webinars out to everybody so that you can do a better job of digging down on those and getting them taken care of. But I think I'd like to ask Lisa to go through a little bit of looking about after COVID, and when I say it's really this misnomer, it's not really after COVID, it's as the surveys resume. What in addition, I mean, looking back at 2018, 2019 is interesting, but what about 2021, 22? What do we see there? And so that's what Lisa's going to take it from here.
Great, thank you, Bud. So we can read everything, and we know this as healthcare providers that was on the hot seat before your heavy hitters before COVID. And let's look at after COVID, or not really, as Bud said, after COVID, but right now in the midst of, certainly we have all of the areas that are COVID related, and now we have to be aware of the Joint Commission and CMS. I lived through a survey where CMS really spent a lot of time in the ambulatory environment related to environment of care and life safety. The CMS offices are insisting that the Joint Commission spend more time in the ambulatory environments, and Joint Commission's new plan is to have either the clinical surveyors or the life safety code surveyors survey these areas. They're training the clinical surveyors to do this. So they will be deploying either of those types of surveyors during a survey. Which surveyor you get deployed to your ambulatory settings for that, looking at the environment of care and life safety, is probably dependent upon the type of care service that ambulatory care area is providing. So I would assume an ambulatory center where they're doing surgeries, likely you'd have the life safety surveyor. A clinic, probably you would have a clinical surveyor, but we don't know. That hasn't happened yet, but it will be. I did live through it, as I said, with CMS, and they sent a life safety surveyor, but we don't anticipate significant findings rolling out from this review, and findings will likely be in that lower 75% of findings that Bud showed you, but you will want to be aware of this and include this in your survey readiness planning. So then the next thing we have to be very aware of is the COVID-related infection prevention will be a focus. We'll discuss that in detail in a minute, and emergency planning and preparedness component. And I do want to take a minute to to talk about vulnerabilities arising through the pre-survey documents review that sort of came about as this virtual process. But before we do that, we're going to move on to the incredible burdens that are being faced with infection prevention control departments to the new COVID focus surveys and COVID in general. So burdens on the infection prevention departments, environmental rounding, identification and resolution of issues. I'm going to take a second and just bring your attention over to the right side of the screen. And this is kind of an obvious thing, but tons and tons of energy and resources have funneled into the hospital's COVID management programs, both the prevention side and the patient management side. What we've seen as we've deployed, and I'm in the field a lot, what we've seen happening in our client hospitals is this huge emphasis on COVID. Attention to other issues has fallen away. So we're spending all of our time on COVID, and we've taken our foot off the gas in relationship to fall prevention or HAPU prevention that previously received intense focus. It's now sort of taken a back seat because everybody's involved with COVID. So we're encouraging you to, I am really strongly encouraging you to assess where your hospital is with the routine high risk issues that you have to be on top of all the time, because COVID is not the only thing hospitals are dealing with. So although it might feel like it. This leads me to the issue of environment of care and environmental rounding. The infection prevention staff, I've seen this so many times lately, have been so tied up with COVID planning, the data reporting that we now have to do and all of that. We found that the preventionists are doing less rounding at a time when more rounding might actually serve the hospital better. Once they find something, however the issue comes up in your hospital, you really have to work to resolve the issue. That's very important. It needs to get resolved and then stay resolved. And we're not going to know if it stays resolved if we don't do rounding and data management. So I just want to focus on that a little bit. Next, you have the emergency management component, which Joint Commission has moved to the front of the survey visit, meaning during your previous Joint Commission surveys, you'd have an interview process where they speak with leadership at the end of your survey. Now, they're moving this interview process with leadership to the front of the line, and they're talking with leadership on the first day of survey to find out what is your emergency management preparation for COVID pandemic and other outbreaks of this nature. They've really moved that from the last day to the first day, and it's an information gathering process to assess leadership's involvement in COVID patient management. So you can expect COVID to move from the last day up to the first day. Some key issues with emergency management that'll be discussed, and you need to make sure that you are not just discussing it, but doing it, is have you included patient placement, staffing and resources? Do you have enough staff to perform COVID-related duties, such as do you have trained screeners, trained triage, and COVID testing staff? Do you have enough staff to manage your inpatient COVID cases? And do you have enough equipment or rooms and spaces and units to house the patients? You may be asked what your plan is to manage a COVID outbreak among staff. There's just a whole host of things that you want to be aware of. The next thing we want to talk about is you'll have to be able to demonstrate your compliance with the interim CMS guidance related to the pandemic, commonly known as the COVID survey. I've been on site for one of the COVID surveys during a CMS full book survey, and I have to tell you, it was very detailed and very involved, and believe me, you will be asked for evidence. We do fully anticipate the Joint Commission survey to follow suit with the COVID surveys, like Bud said, to have a checklist. They just go right down the list, and they want to see that your plan follows up compliant. Another issue you're going to be very aware of is compliance with all of the infection prevention issues surrounding sterilization and disinfection. This is one of the heavy hitters that gets cited during survey all the time. More importantly, don't care about a survey citation, I care about patient safety. Sterilization, disinfection poses patient safety issues, so you want to make sure you remain in compliance with all your equipment MFUs, that you're abiding by CDC, AORN, and the AMI guidance related to sterilization and disinfection. And these processes occur everywhere in hospitals. They're all over the place in hospitals, in little nooks and crannies where you're not really aware that some places it has an autoclave or they're doing disinfection, in clinics and so forth. So the topic should really intense focus. Sterilization and disinfection are really complex processes that takes in sometimes we've seen up to a year to button down in a hospital. So please pay attention to that. Don't let that fall off your radar. We do have Greeley has a great, very detailed webinar on that on Greeley's website, so feel free to go there. Next thing we want to make sure that we're very aware of and compliant with is the staff training and competency as related to COVID. All things infection prevention and control, as noted earlier. Very important to have your staff education and competency available and up to date as it relates to COVID. You will be asked for compliance for evidence for the appropriate education and training of your staff, for managing patients, and they will, I've seen them actually go into the staff files and look for COVID specific education and training for those staff that are on the front line with COVID. Also, respiratory protection programs are very important. If one of your staff is wearing an N95 respirator mask, they must show evidence of fit testing and the education on how to use that and where and when to use it. So we want to make sure that we're following our OSHA respiratory protection programs. Surgical attire, we don't want to forget about that. That remains on the Joint Commission's radar, and you want to look up the latest discussions on that. You can follow the Joint Commission's discussion in the April 2019 perspectives. Bottom line, head and facial hair still have to be covered. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. I'm going to move to the use of PPE, or better said, the appropriate use of PPE. And I can tell you, you will have every surveyor on site, even the life safety surveyor, looking at how staff is employing their use of PPE. It's critical to preventing the spread of COVID and other transmittable diseases. So I'm going to ask you, are you sure that A, your staff have enough PPE, the right types of PPE, and that B, your staff is wearing and disposing of PPE correctly? So why do I say this? I go to hospitals all the time, and I'm reviewing a unit, and I see PPE hanging on the back of a door, a used gown, or I see a used gown slung over an overbed table, or I see a used gown tucked under the guardrail along the patient care unit. None of that is a one-time use and you dispose of it. Or I see reusable PPE gowns, which there are those that are supposed to be used once, taken off and put in the patient's hamper. And I had a staff member tell me, oh, I use it all day. I mean, you use it all, you go in and out of the room. Yes, I go, it's the greatest thing ever. Don't understand that. So we want to make sure the education that we give staff is actually being understood and correctly employed as they provide patient care. The other thing I just want to mention, if your policy, if your hospital requires eyewear because of the droplet component of COVID, then they have to wear the eyewear. So if you require it, you have to do it. If you don't require it, they don't have to do it. The next thing we want to talk about is you want to make sure you have a solid program to respond to patient and staff exposures with the appropriate testing available, and how to implement your outbreak plan if you suspect widespread transmission. So, for example, who in your hospital will be responsible for identifying contacts that you have to then go research? The healthcare providers, visitors, family that perhaps come in contact with the positive COVID situation, notifying them of potential exposures. How will such notifications occur? What actions are needed? And then when will healthcare providers be allowed to come back to work? Those are things that have to be carefully thought out, and I'm sure you probably already have those in a plan. Managing aerosol generating procedures has also received a lot of attention as we move through the pandemic, with national agencies previously bouncing back and forth on whether COVID was airborne or droplet. They've sort of centered on droplet. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but I will direct you to the CDC has interim guidelines listing 7 aerosol generating procedures. There's an article out that the CDC does reference, which is Tran, T-R-A-N, et al., which lists 4 aerosol generating procedures, which are non-invasive ventilation like CPAP and BiPAP, tracheotomy, manual ventilation before intubation, and tracheal intubation. Because there's no consensus yet from the recommending agencies, and CDC and APIC are both working with other agencies too, to come up with a consensus model for all facilities. But because there's no consensus model, you are allowed to, the organization is allowed to generate their own list of aerosol generating procedures and follow that list. We suggest that you start with the 4 procedures that are listed in the PRAN article, and then add on as your organization feels is appropriate. But you do have to sort of identify that and then determine how you're going to manage that. I want to mention quickly that managing airborne infection isolation rooms, many hospitals have created negative pressure rooms when they don't have a patient that's going to have any aerosol generating procedure, and they don't need to be in those rooms. So you might want to look at that. Finally, we think that the hospital is going to need to be nimble in its ability to track and manage cases and to be able to move quickly as there's rapid changes related to COVID throughout the industry. So you have to have a good tracking program, and you have to be able to implement those changes and guidelines rapidly. So Bud, we're going to change topics now, and that's a lot of information that's just been thrown at you, and we're happy to discuss that later. But we do need to switch topics now. We're going to talk about the virtual survey, the impact of virtual surveys. But if you go to the next slide, Bud did explain earlier sort of the virtual survey process, and I don't want to take too much time because we're running out of it. The Joint Commission, Bud talked about some of those things that they were doing. The virtual surveys where they get everybody together on a Zoom or a Teamworks or a GoToMeeting, whatever happens to happen, whatever virtual process, and they conduct the survey. They have an agenda for the first day of survey. The lead surveyor follows that agenda. Then as the survey progresses, the lead surveyor may turf to the other complement of surveyors. But the most important thing that I want to discuss right now as you look at this slide is the Joint Commission's offline review of documents. They're asking organizations to upload in advance all of the documents that are requested in the surveyor activity guide. And this poses a huge vulnerability, if you will, for hospitals, because that offline review of documents, the surveyors now have all the time in the world to look at your documents. Before, during a regular survey process, they would ask for some documents in a room, and they'd have an hour ahead of time, and they'd look at this and that, flip through it, and then they would deploy out to units. And then as the survey progressed, there'd be a onesie twosie kind of, hey, give me this policy, give me that, no more. What they found with the virtual survey is they really, really liked the fact that they would have the hospital upload a secure SharePoint file that the Joint Commission used, all the documents in the SAG, the Survey Activity Guide. So that gave them unlimited time to look at minutes, to look at policies, to look at previous findings from your state agency reports that you might have gotten. What does that result in? Well, when they have all the time in the world to look at your minutes, while they did not ask for infection control or quality or Department of History minutes, they're looking at governing body and medical executive committee minutes. And in those minutes, likely you're going to find some other problems or issues that are discussed that would engender a drill down to QAPI, infection control, sterilization, whatever it might be. So before breezing through them in a shortened span of time, they may not find that. Taking their time, which they set up with the feet up in front of the fireplace for weeks ahead of time before the survey, they have the time to look through that. One of the things to note is they contact your organization following the virtual process to ask you to upload these documents. They still cannot tell you when they're going to be arriving. But to me, if somebody called me and said, hey, get your documents uploaded, I'd be thinking, oh, I might be getting a survey. But we just wanted to focus on the fact that this presents a huge vulnerability. Now, policies, I want to talk a little bit about policies. They have all the time in the world to go through your policies. So one of the things that we think is very important is because they're looking at policies sort of in their own time frame, you are at risk for policies that are overly burdensome or are more complex than perhaps the actual process. So a surveyor might look at the 20-page policy and say, I don't think that this 20-page policy is really happening in actual practice, I'm going to go look and see if the actual practice matches the policy. You know, that old say what you do and then you darn well better do what you say, which is why Greeley always advocates for a simple 2-page policy that aligns the regulations with operations in a real simplified, implementable format. That's a really important issue here, so I want to take a minute and just restate the fact. The Joint Commission is going to have all the time they want to review your policies to look and see if you actually follow them. So if you have a huge policy heavy with regulatory language that doesn't simply direct and connect operationally with staff, you can bet the surveyors will poke holes in it, and they're going to go observe practice, virtually observing it. If they're doing a virtual survey via the EMR, they can look in your EMR and say, oh, you're not meeting your pain policy, or oh, you're not meeting your whatever policy. So just know that that's a huge vulnerability. The other thing that is on the screen here, previous findings, including state and CMS findings, they have all the time that they need to go through a 100-page 2567 state CMS deficiency report to find out where your previous problems were, and if in fact you've corrected them. They actually will have a roadmap to where your high vulnerability points are. So we want to make sure that you understand that represents a big vulnerability. The challenge in the past was just to have the documents ready. The challenge now is those documents are going to be looked at to make sure that you're demonstrating effective follow-through on your actions and your credibility. So, Bud, we're on slide there. Thank you. So we've thrown a lot of. Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, you go.
No, you.
Go.
Okay, we've thrown a lot of information at you, and now is probably the time to summarize the anticipated changes in the Joint Commission survey process. First of all, the number of survey findings will remain the same. We think might be a little bit higher. We don't anticipate them going down. You can bet that the heat that infection prevention and control topics bring will go way up. Infection control and prevention will be incredibly burdened in the survey process. Also, as policies, minutes, and other documents receive this intensive review I've just talked about, you can expect to have some findings rolling out from them. And you can expect there to be a number of significant findings related to any burdensome policy expectations. And if you, as they're looking through documents, if you've not followed through on promises you've made to the organization or to outside agencies, you can expect that to come back. We anticipate surveyors finding some hospitals really aren't meeting their corrective action plans, either with the Joint Commission or with state agencies, and we know that might be a big problem. So what this means to you is that the SAFER method, the SAFER matrix, the methodology, and the consistent interpretation of findings, which we think are a very good thing that the Joint Commission's done, it now means that the Joint Commission can focus on repeat high importance findings, which can trigger adverse actions for many organizations. So we know that the Joint Commission is not going to give organizations a lot of second chances. That's been very clear in the conversations we've had with them, because they really can't now that CMS has sort of revised how they're looking at the Joint Commission. So the Joint Commission really has fixed their processes to move to a more valid method of compliance evaluation. You will have to make sure that you're ready to meet that. But I'm going to let you talk about focus and simplifying as we're moving through this.
So, yeah, thanks, Lisa. A lot of information there. And so we're getting towards the end of our time. I just want to say that there are implications for the way that you respond to the survey findings in the first place. Well, if you get a 2567 in or a Joint Commission report, the way you respond is incredibly important. And the way you prepare has to change. You can't continue to look at thousands of insignificant things. You have to look at the few really truly significant things and make sure they're changed. For more information about that, though, I'm going to refer you to our July 15th. That's still up on the website. We're going into detail of what we think those changes should be. So just then summarizing then, you know, there are many reasons why it's essential for hospitals to change focus. Instead of fix everything and fix it quickly, you need to focus on the valid issues. I mean, and we know, how long have we known, Lisa, and everybody else on the phone, how long have we known that infection prevention is a big problem? How many of
Long.
us have really fixed it? I was doing surveys in the 70s and 80s. I hate to tell you that I'm that old. Yes, Bud's that old. Infection prevention was a problem then, it's a problem today. You're not going to be allowed to continue that. And it's not just infection prevention, there are other issues as well. And each hospital has its own matrix of issues. As Lisa was going through all this stuff in infection prevention, and we just got a new nuance from the Joint Commission here 5 minutes before we went on air, where they're talking about wanting documentation of certain things, and we're trying to work through that. We're going to have a series that just drills down on infection prevention, and hopefully doesn't just say, here's your list of 1,000 things to do, but sort of focuses and say, here's a practical approach to getting this done within the next few months. So we'll do that. As a result of all of that, we just want to remind you that we will be doing more educational events on all these things in all of these areas that we have specialties, from behavioral health, infection prevention, patient safety in general, environment of care. So stay tuned to our website. Unfortunately, I don't have any too much time. We've got 2 minutes here. So in those 2 minutes, Ty, can you go through, and we'll stay on the air a little bit afterwards. If you have any lingering questions from the session today, I will answer them, each one of them. We'll post it on a blog, and we'll send an email to all attendees with the answers to the questions that you might have. So Ty, can you just remind everybody as to, I'm going to go ahead and show the screen up here again. So Ty, are you there?
I'm here.
So go ahead and remind
All
everybody
right.
how to submit the questions. Yeah.
If you have a question, please enter your question in the questions tab, which is located on your control panel.
Just go ahead and enter that over here, and we'll keep this online a little bit just so that you'll have the time to enter the questions. And I want to conclude my thoughts by thanking you for your participation today. And please keep Greeley and Chartis in mind as you look to solve these things in the future. Lisa, do you have any closing comments as people are entering their questions?
Yeah, I do. I do want to emphasize again, I gave a reference to the aerosol generating procedure that had the 4 main procedures in it. And it's, I'm just going to tell everybody, you can go online and search TRAN, et al, and you will get the document that lists those 4 aerosol generating procedures, and the CDC and other APIC and whatnot are also utilizing that source. It's a evidence-based article that I know people were curious about that. So that's TRAN et al. And I just wanted to kick around with you for a minute and might answer some folks' questions. We haven't heard the time frame that Joint Commission is allowing hospitals to upload the documents. So I haven't heard myself in any of the calls I've been on how far in advance and how long they actually have to. I thought I heard like a week to get everything uploaded, but what have you heard?
Well, what happens is when you're coming up on the survey window, you'll work individually with your account rep. Different hospitals have different sort of platforms, and they'll take different times. And so once everything is uploaded, so there'll be variable times to upload it. So the account representative will work with you to meet your demands. Normally they want it in a week, but you may have to scan some items and it may take you longer than that. And then at that point, the window of uncertainty begins once everything's uploaded.
Right.
So,
And in my experience, and because this is a new process, the Joint Commission's been, from what I've heard, very amenable to working with clients. They're not, being objectionable about if somebody has an issue with their platform. So just a comment.
So our time has expired, unfortunately. And so please, again, please check back at our greeley.com next week. And if you have any detailed questions or personal questions for either Lisa or myself, this is going to be the time to go ahead and email us. And there's information at greeley.com, or you can get to us through our website, greeley.com, or you can email myself personally, and I'll triage that for you. My email address is B as in Bud, Pate, P-A-T-E. So B Bravo, P Papa, A Alpha, T Tango, E Echo, at Greeley.com. Don't forget the E, Greeley.com. Thank you everybody for attending, and we will look forward to hosting you at our next webinar, probably about infection control. Thanks, Lisa. Thanks, Ty.
You got it. Thanks, Bud. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. This concludes our meeting. On behalf of the Greeley Company, I'd like to thank you for joining us today, and we hope you found this information and dialogue valuable in supporting your organization.